February 2nd, 1943. Over the North Sea. Snow whipped sideways across the canopy as the Avro Lancaster lumbered through the black void above the North Sea. The night was alive with static wind tearing at the fuselage engines, howling in uneven rhythm, radio crackling with bursts of Morse. Lightning flickered in the distance, and for a moment it lit the aircraft's swollen belly, a prototype H-2S radar dish hidden behind a radome, and inside the navigator's bay, bolted into a small metal casing, a device unlike anything else on Earth. Flight Lieutenant Arthur MacLeod leaned over his plotting board, pencil clenched in his teeth. His breath fogged the dim red light of the cabin. The altimeter wavered. "Steady at 9,000, skipper," he called. From the pilot's seat, squadron leader Peter Carmichael fought the yoke. "Feels like flying a bloody anvil." "Where's our position crossing grid Charlie 4 just north of Texel?" MacLeod replied, tracing over the chart. "We're halfway home." Carmichael's eyes flicked to the fuel gauge. "Halfway home's good enough for me." In the bomb bay where the H-2S set pulsed with soft blue light, Sergeant Eddie Holloway, the radar operator, watched the cathode ray tube bloom and fade, ghostly green shapes crawling across the glass. "I've got returns," he said quietly. "You can actually see the coastline, cliffs, rivers, towns. It's all there. Bloody magic." MacLeod leaned over his shoulder. "You're telling me that's radar, not reflection, not cloud. Scatter." Holloway nodded, grinning. "This little box sees in the dark, and she never blinks." Above them, a lightning bolt split the sky, white, merciless. Then the intercom hissed. "Tail gunner to skipper. Contact starboard high, bandit closing fast." The mood shifted instantly. Carmichael barked evasive and threw the Lancaster into a dive. The engines roared, the airframe shuddered. Tracer fire ripped past the right wing, carving red streaks through the snow. "Bloody hell, it's a Ju-88, the gunner shouted. Closing 600 yards, MacLeod grabbed the flare pistol and jammed a cartridge into it. "Chaff's useless in this storm, then shoot the bastard," Carmichael growled. The tail gun rattled. Twin Brownings spat fire into the night. The German night fighter broke off, banking hard left, but not before its cannon rounds found their mark. A burst of shells tore through the port wing. Metal screamed. The bomber lurched. Lights flickered. The H-2S display died with a soft pop. "Port engines hit," shouted the flight engineer. "We're losing pressure." Carmichael fought the controls. "Feather it. Dump the payload." "No payload aboard, sir. Just the experimental kit," MacLeod shouted back. That word experimental hung in the air like a curse. They all knew what that meant: secret cargo. Something so valuable that if captured, it could rewrite the war. The Lancaster limped onward, its left wing aflame. "Navigator, give me a bearing." MacLeod checked the compass. 220 to England, but we're not going to make it. "We're dropping altitude fast." The engineer swore. "Hydraulics are gone." Carmichael looked at his crew, at their eyes wide behind goggles, the frost clinging to their flight suits. "We can't ditch with this aboard." If Jerry gets it, MacLeod already knew what he was thinking. He reached under the radar table, unbolting the small, lead-lined casing that held the magnetron, the heart of the machine. It was no bigger than a teacup, but its polished copper cavities shimmered faintly even in the failing light. "This little thing," MacLeod whispered, "cost more than the plane." Carmichael's voice came hard. "Then make sure no one else ever gets it." MacLeod nodded once, wrapped the unit in oilcloth, and strapped it to his chest. The altimeter spun. Clouds ripped past. Below them, the North Sea boiled in moonlight. "Brace," Carmichael shouted. The Lancaster struck the water like a hammer. The fuselage shattered. Darkness swallowed them. For a long moment, there was only silence, the cold, endless silence of the sea. Hours later, dawn rose gray and weak over the Dutch coast. A fisherman from the village of Noordwijk spotted debris washing ashore, twisted aluminum torn fabric, and the red, white, blue roundel of the RAF. German patrols arrived within minutes, sweeping the beach. They found two bodies tangled in parachute lines and half buried in the sand nearby, a metal case marked property of His Majesty's government. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained cloth, lay the magnetron. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Carl Beck, turned it over in his gloved hands. "What the devil is this? Some kind of radio?" The technician beside him frowned. "Not like any I've seen. Look here, copper cavities, precision cut. This isn't a transmitter. It's something new." Beck's eyes narrowed. "Get it to Peenemünde. Now." As the wind howled across the dunes, he wrapped the device carefully and carried it toward the waiting truck, unaware that what he held was the beating heart of the Allies' invisible empire. In England 2 days later, a coded transmission reached Bletchley Park, Lancaster, lost near Texel. Secret apparatus presumed compromised. In a cramped control hut, a young physicist named Dr. John Randall, one of the magnetron's creators, stared at the message in silence. "Then it's begun," he murmured. "What has asked his colleague?" Randall looked up, eyes hollow. "The race they don't even know they've already lost." February 4th, 1943. Peenemünde Research Center, Germany. The convoy rolled through the snow-clogged gates of Peenemünde, headlights dimmed, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Inside the covered truck, beneath layers of tarpaulin and straw, lay the small metal case retrieved from the Dutch shore, unremarkable except for the way the escort handled it, as if it were an unexploded bomb. Dr. Hans Meyer, physicist and technical officer for the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, waited near the security barrier with a cigarette trembling between his fingers. The Baltic wind tore at his coat, scattering ash across his papers. He had been summoned from Berlin with a single line of instruction: object recovered, priority alpha, analysis confidential. Report directly to Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. When the truck finally stopped before him, 2 soldiers jumped down, saluted, and presented the crate. Mayer's eyes narrowed behind his round spectacles. "This is it." The sergeant nodded. "Found near Nordwijk. RAF bomber downed. 2 crew dead, 1 unaccounted for. The object was sealed." Mayer gestured toward the laboratory doors. "Take it inside, carefully, and send for Dr. Stepp." Inside the Peenemünde instrumentation hall, the air smelled of hot oil and ozone. Oscilloscopes hummed faintly. Wires hung from the ceiling like vines. At the far end of the hall, the Reich's best minds had been working for years to master radio detection. The Freya early warning sets, the Würzburg tracking dishes, the primitive airborne interceptors that never quite worked in the clouds. And now here sat something new on Mayer's workbench. A compact metal cylinder barely 6 inches across, gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. Dr. Wilhelm Stepp, a radar engineer from Telefunken, entered briskly, gloves still dusted with snow. "So this is the British toy, eh?" He smirked. "Perhaps it's another of their jokes. They're very good at those." Mayer said nothing. He unlatched the casing, lifted the lid, and both men stared. The device looked almost alive, a copper heart ringed with resonant cavities, each one machined with impossible precision. Thin silver wires coiled around the magnet assembly like veins. A small tag bore the inscription E1989 CV64. Stepp leaned closer. "I've never seen machining like this. The tolerances. This isn't laboratory work. It's production quality." Mayer ran a finger over the smooth copper, awe replacing skepticism. "Do you realize what this is?" he murmured. "If I'm correct, this is not a transmitter. It's a resonator." But the frequency, he reached for a frequency meter, connected the leads, and turned on the power supply. The hum built soft at first, then rising into a sharp, steady tone that made the metal benches vibrate. Stepp stared at the gauge. "That can't be right. 10 centimeters, no. The wavelength is far too short. It must be a calibration error." Mayer shook his head. "It's not an error. This thing operates in the microwave band." Stepp frowned. "Microwave impossible. No valve can sustain that output. The heat alone would," Mayer interrupted, voice low. unless they've solved the cooling problem. Look at the cavities, the design. It's ingenious. The fields resonate within the copper. The heat dissipates through the structure. They've done it. He exhaled slowly. Mein Gott. They've done it. Within hours, word reached Oberst Hermann Diehl, the Luftwaffe's technical liaison. He arrived furious, convinced the scientists were exaggerating. "You're telling me this tiny thing is more advanced than our entire Würzburg network?" he demanded. "That's absurd." Mayer simply gestured toward the bench. "See for yourself." They powered it again. The meter needle leapt. The interference crackled through every nearby radio. Diehl stepped back, eyes narrowing. "What power output is that?" "Several hundred watts at 10 centimeters, Mayer said quietly. "At least an order of magnitude beyond our current magnetrons. And it's stable." Diehl rubbed his temples. "So they can... What fit radar in a plane now?" Mayer nodded. "A bomber. A fighter. A submarine. Anything." Silence filled the room. The wind howled outside against the laboratory windows. Stepp finally spoke. "Then that explains everything. They're night bombers. They find targets through cloud and darkness, as if guided by God himself. And we thought it was luck." Mayer leaned on the table, staring at the device. "It's not luck. It's physics. And we're 10 years behind it." The discovery moved up the chain like an electric current. Reports were dispatched to Berlin, each stamped Geheime Kommandosache. By the time it reached Albert Speer, the tone had shifted from disbelief to alarm. In one of his private conferences, Speer would later recall asking, "Could we build one?" Mayer's answer was short and heavy. "Not in time to matter." At midnight, Mayer remained in the lab long after the others had gone. He stood before the magnetron, now resting quietly on the bench beneath a glass dome. He thought of how just 3 years earlier the Reich had been certain of technological superiority: jets, rockets, V-weapons. But here lay proof that the true war, the invisible war of electrons and wavelengths, had already been lost. He switched off the lights. The magnetron gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a small, silent sun in a world racing toward darkness. Outside, the Baltic wind carried the distant thunder of test rockets screaming toward the sky, primitive, violent, magnificent, but useless against the invisible power that now ruled the night. February 6, 1943. Bletchley Park, England. The rain had not stopped in days. Sheets of water hammered the tin roofs of Bletchley Park, turning the code-breaking huts into echo chambers of dripping steel and caffeine-soaked tension. The air smelled of wet wool ink and burned coffee, the perfume of a nation surviving on secrecy. Inside Hut 8, John Randall, co-inventor of the cavity magnetron, leaned against a radiator that barely worked. His colleague Harry Boots scribbled notes across a blueprint, while chain-smoking ash falling like snow. A teleprinter chattered beside them, its ribbon spitting out another decrypted Luftwaffe message. Randall read it once, frowned, and passed it to Boot. Intercept from Peenemünde. Keywords include copper resonator, high-frequency device, and recovered from crash. Boot's cigarette froze halfway to his lips. "Oh no, they've got it." Randall nodded grimly. "The magnetron from the H-2S test plane." He crossed the room, pulling down the blackout curtain. Outside, a convoy of lorries rumbled through the muddy driveway, supplies bound for Malvern, where British radar research had moved after Coventry. Inside, the air buzzed with typewriters and tension. "They'll study it," Boot said quietly. "They'll realize what it is." Randall lit a match and stared at the flame. "Let them. Knowing what it is and knowing how to make it are two different worlds." Hours later, a message arrived from the radiation laboratory at MIT encoded in layers of cipher so complex it took 3 staffers to unravel. Magnetron production accelerated. Shipment of 20 units to Coastal Command approved. Airborne radar integration proceeding. American manufacturing scale now operational. Randall allowed himself a thin smile. They'll build thousands, he said. We can't stop losses like the Texel crash, but we can make sure every loss is irrelevant. Boot exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. You realize the irony? They'll never know your name, John. Not one of them. But every plane that finds its way home will owe you. Randall didn't reply. He just looked at the rain streaking the window, thinking of the crew who'd gone down over the North Sea, men who had carried his creation into hell. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the MIT radiation laboratory hummed with life 24 hours a day. Engineers in rolled-up sleeves and grease-stained ties clustered around banks of oscilloscopes, their voices competing with the whine of generators. Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, paced through the aisles pipe in hand, smoke curling like thought itself. Gentlemen, he announced, our British allies have given us the key. The magnetron is our gateway to dominance. We must turn it from a miracle into an industry. Lee Dubridge, the lab's director, nodded. Radar for every aircraft, every ship, every bomber. This is mass production science. We'll bury the enemy in detection. Bush tapped the table, then bury them faster. The chalkboard behind him was covered in equations, but beneath it someone had scrawled half as a joke and half as prophecy. The Battle of Britain was fought in the air. The next will be fought in the ether. At Peenemünde, that invisible battle was already being lost. Dr. Hans Meyer sat before a bank of German Würzburg components, large, crude, and obsolete by comparison. His assistant struggled to calibrate the receiver. Static filled the room. They rely on amplitude modulation, Meyer muttered half to himself. We're chasing reflections with the precision of a blind man. Stepp entered holding a folder. Berlin wants results. They believe we can replicate the device. Meyer shook his head. We can't. The purity of the copper, the vacuum integrity, even the cathode design. These are not one-off experiments. They have mastered production. We would need new alloys, new tools, new minds. Stepp frowned. Then what do we tell them? The truth, Meyer said. That the Reich's vision of technical supremacy is a mirage. We built rockets that reach the stratosphere, yet we can't build a valve that sings at 10 centimeters. He stared again at the British magnetron under its glass dome. Its silence was mocking its beauty absolute. Back in Berlin, a meeting convened in the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. The room was filled with smoke and pride, two of the Reich's favorite elements. Generals, engineers, and bureaucrats sat around the oak table, maps spread before them like open wounds. Oberst Diehl stood beside Meyer's report. Gentlemen, the British have achieved what we thought impossible. Their magnetron allows radar that fits inside aircraft. They can navigate, bomb, and intercept in complete darkness. They see us when we cannot see them. General Kamhuber, commander of the night fighter defenses, slammed his fist on the table. Then what do you propose? That we surrender? Meyer kept his voice level. No, Herr General. I propose you understand what we face. The Allies have not just an advantage, they have a generation's lead. Every night they fly guided by a technology that will define the future. We can jam their frequencies, but we cannot erase their knowledge. Speer, sitting in the corner, exhaled smoke. And knowledge, he said quietly, is the only weapon that grows stronger the more you use it. In London, the air raid sirens wailed again that night. Over Bristol, another wave of German bombers droned toward the coast. But this time, waiting for them, clouds, were Beaufighter night interceptors equipped with AI MiG-as V8 radar, powered by magnetrons identical to the one now under glass in Peenemünde. Inside one of those fighters, Flight Lieutenant Ronald Garrett scanned his radar scope. I've got him range 1.8 miles, closing fast. His pilot, Tom Armitage, grinned beneath his oxygen mask. Then let's give Jerry a proper welcome. They never saw the bomber. They didn't need to. The radar did. And for the first time in history, the night sky was no longer blind. Down in Peenemünde, Meyer watched his breath fog the laboratory window as another rocket test flared across the horizon. The scientists cheered in the distance. But Mayer's gaze stayed fixed on the magnetron, its copper heart glowing softly under the lamplight. "We're building fire," he whispered, "while they're building sight." March 1943. Peenemünde and Berlin. The snow had turned to gray slush outside Peenemünde, but the laboratory stayed lit around the clock. The magnetron sat at the center of a table, surrounded by notebooks, soldering irons, and exhausted men. A cigarette burned to its filter beside Dr. Hans Mayer, who hadn't slept in 36 hours. Across from him, Wilhelm Stepp adjusted the filament voltage, muttering under his breath. "We can't reproduce it, Hans. Every sample we build burns out after 2 minutes." Mayer rubbed his eyes. "Then it's not a materials problem. It's a geometry problem." Stepp scowled. "You mean the cavities again? I've milled them to 1/10 of a millimeter." Mayer gestured toward the captured magnetron. "The British one is uniform at 1/100th. You see the polish on the copper walls. That's done by precision lathes we don't even possess. It's not a design error, it's a civilization gap." A low hum filled the room as they powered up another prototype. Sparks jumped from the cathode, the oscilloscope trace danced wildly, then flatlined. Smoke curled from the chamber. Stepp cursed in German and slammed the switch. Another one gone. Mayer stared at the smoking wreckage, then at the original magnetron. It sat silent, perfect, eternal. "The Allies are flying with hundreds of these," he murmured. "Thousands, perhaps. And we're still burning holes in copper." Hours later, Mayer was called to Berlin. A black Mercedes took him through sleet and mud headlights, off guard, silent. When he arrived at the Luftwaffe Ministerium, he was ushered into a narrow conference room thick with tobacco smoke. Waiting inside were General Josef Kammhuber Albert Speer and Oberst Hermann Diehl. Kammhuber's tone was curt. "Doctor, we've read your report. 10 years behind, explain." Mayer placed a folder on the table. "Their magnetron operates at 10 centimeters, with power exceeding our largest laboratory models by a factor of 100. They can install it in aircraft. Our Würzburg stations, by contrast, require a truck." Speer leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Is it a question of resources or understanding?" Both, Mayer said simply. "We lack the industrial infrastructure for such precision. Our machining cannot achieve their tolerances. Our vacuum tubes cannot sustain their frequencies. Even if we poured Reichsmarks into it today, we wouldn't see production for years." Kammhuber's jaw tightened. "Years we don't have." Diehl flicked his cigarette into an ashtray. "So we do nothing." Mayer hesitated. "We jam their radar where possible. We improve our receivers. But direct imitation is futile." Speer exhaled slowly. "Then we focus where they are not rockets, jets, countermeasures. Anything that moves faster than detection." Kammhuber muttered, "You can't outrun what you can't see." Mayer's reply was quiet, almost defiant. "But they can't hide from it. That's the difference." That evening, Mayer walked alone through the Tiergarten. Berlin was dark now, a city of silhouettes and whispers. Anti-aircraft searchlights swept the sky like pale blades, and somewhere above the clouds, invisible bombers droned. He thought of the device in his laboratory, the heart of Allied vision, and wondered whether its silence mocked him or pitied him. A voice behind him startled him. "Dr. Mayer." It was Professor Rudolf Kuhnhold, one of Germany's earliest radar pioneers. His face was pale-lined by years of bureaucratic neglect. "They've finally listened to you," Kuhnhold said softly. Mayer smiled bitterly. "Too late." "They were always too late," Kuhnhold replied. "I warned them in 1937 that centimetric waves would change warfare. They laughed. They said the physics was impossible." Mayer exhaled. "Now they'll say the defeat is inevitable." Kuhnhold placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not inevitable. just invisible. Across the channel, that same night the skies above Essen glowed orange. RAF Pathfinder Force, using H-2S radar powered by hundreds of magnetrons, was guiding Lancasters through cloud and flak to their targets. Inside one of the bombers, Flight Officer Eddie Holloway's successor, a young operator named Bill Harris, stared at the green phosphor screen. He spoke quietly into his intercom, target visual confirmed. Radar picture clear as daylight. Through the scope, the city appeared not as a skyline but as a living map, rivers, railways, the shining geometry of industry. The magnetron painted it in light no human eyes could see. "Bombs away," the pilot said. Moments later, the city erupted in fire. 200 miles away, German radar operators at Würzburg stations watched their scopes in frustration. The interference was overwhelming noise ghosts, false echoes. One technician turned to his superior. "Sir, I can't track them. It's as if they're ghosts." The officer's reply was bitter. "They are ghosts, and they're using our own air against us." At Peenemünde, Meyer stood again over the glass dome encasing the British magnetron. He wrote a single note in his logbook before extinguishing the lamp. "They have mastered invisibility. We have mastered excuses." Then he closed the book and left the lab, the sound of rocket engines thundering outside, a nation mistaking noise for progress. April 1943. MIT Radiation Laboratory, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The spring sun glinted off the Charles River as a convoy of military trucks rumbled through the gates of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, Rad Lab, as its sleepless engineers called it. Inside Building 20, behind blackout curtains and guarded doors, a quiet revolution was underway. Rows of magnetrons lined the benches, each glowing faintly under test current, tiny suns pulsing at microwave frequencies. The air buzzed with the hum of transformers and the smell of ozone. On a chalkboard, someone had written in big letters, "See the unseen." Dr. Lee Dubridge, the director, moved through the chaos like a conductor. "Keep the cooling steady on Unit 32. The vacuum's holding, but the seals are sweating." Dr. Ed Purcell, sleeves rolled, adjusted a scope trace. "We're reaching stable output, 9.7 centimeters, 600 watts sustained." A young engineer whistled. "That's twice last week's record." Dubridge grinned. "Good. Then let's double it again." He turned to a visiting British officer in RAF Blue Group, Captain R.V. Jones, one of the men who had first deciphered Germany's radar network. Jones watched in awe. "I knew you Yanks had scale," he said, "but I didn't expect a cathedral of physics." Dubridge chuckled. "Cathedrals are built for prayer. This one's for victory." Across the Atlantic, Germany's best scientists were still locked in laboratories staring at broken prototypes. But in Cambridge, the magnetron had gone from miracle to assembly line. Within weeks, General Electric and Western Electric were turning out magnetrons by the hundreds. They were shipped to Bendix Raytheon and RCA for integration into radar sets, each stamped "Made in USA War Emergency Production." By summer, radar-guided bombing, anti-submarine warfare, and night interception were no longer theory. They were reality. In the testing hangar at Bedford Army Airfield, engineers fitted the new SCR-584 radar to a B-24 Liberator. The bomb bay was stripped bare to house the rotating dish. The crew, mostly fresh-faced engineers turned soldiers, crowded around the humming unit as the radar swept through the hangar. The green scope flared with a distinct echo. "That's the hangar wall," said Lieutenant Frank Tuttle, eyes wide. "At 100 yards, we're seeing it through steel." The supervising officer smiled. "Get used to it, Lieutenant. You're looking into tomorrow." Meanwhile, at Langley Navy, officers debated the next step. Should radar remain a guarded secret, or should it blanket the entire fleet? Commander Chester Chet Bragg, a grizzled destroyer captain, turned technical officer, slammed his palm on the table. Gentlemen's secrecy won't win this war. Coverage will. Every destroyer, every corvette, every escort ship needs radar. It's our eyes in the fog. One admiral frowned. Even if the enemy learns from it, Bragg leaned forward. By the time they understand what we're using, we'll already be using something better. It became the unwritten doctrine of Allied science, perpetual innovation as defense. Back at the Rad Lab, Dubridge received a classified cable from London marked. Most secret Peenemünde scientists have recovered magnetron from downed bomber. German analysis ongoing. Intelligence estimates replication unlikely within 5 years. Dubridge read it twice, then set it aside with a sigh. 5 years is an eternity in this war, he murmured. Behind him, Vannevar Bush entered pipe in hand. Problem. Dubridge shook his head. No, sir. Just thinking how strange it is. We're building the tools that let men see through night, and somewhere out there men are dying to keep them secret. Bush puffed thoughtfully. That's always the bargain, Lee. Science gives light, war demands it stay dark. The next day, an RAF liaison arrived from Washington with fresh intelligence. He carried a thin manila envelope stamped Ultra and a faint smell of salt from the Atlantic. Inside was a single translated German report, intercepted from Peenemünde, British microwave transmitter examined. Output exceeds known theoretical limits. Estimated technological delay 8 to 10 years. Purcell read it aloud to the lab voice, trembling with disbelief. 8 to 10 years. A cheer erupted through the hall. Dubridge smiled wearily. Let's make it 12. In a small corner office, Group Captain Jones telephoned London via secure line. Tell them, he said, that the Yanks are not just matching us, they're accelerating. The magnetron's no longer a secret. It's a system. They're building 1,000 eyes for the night sky. The voice on the other end asked, and the Germans. Jones leaned back, staring at the rows of glowing copper hearts. They're still looking for the light switch. Far away in a darkened lab at Peenemünde, Dr. Hans Meyer read the same intercepted Allied bulletin, a captured leaflet describing microwave proximity fuses fitted to naval shells. He knew instantly what powered them. He exhaled sharply, the cigarette trembling in his hand. They've taken the magnetron to the battlefield. Stepp looked up. And us, Mayer dropped the ash into a tray. We're still in the classroom. By nightfall, the Allied bombers were back over Europe, each one guided by unseen waves born from that copper core. To the men who flew them, radar was just a green blur on a screen. To the men who built it, it was the sound of time itself, measured in microseconds, turning chaos into order and invisibility into victory. May 1943, Western Europe. The night sky over occupied France shimmered with cold starlight, silent, endless, indifferent. But through that darkness, unseen by the human eye, waves of energy pulsed outward in perfect rhythm, bouncing off steel rock and cloud. Radar had made the invisible visible, and for the first time in history, the Allies saw through the night. High above the English Channel, a formation of Bristol Beaufighters cruised at 16,000 feet, engines droning in the black. Inside one of them, Flight Lieutenant Tom Armitage adjusted the throttle while his radar operator Bill Harris leaned over a glowing cathode tube. Contact, Harris whispered. Range 2 miles, starboard 20 degrees. Armitage smiled faintly beneath his oxygen mask. Right where we expected him. They turned into the intercept. The blip on the radar drew closer, a Junkers Ju-88 night fighter, unaware that it was already being hunted. Target closing. Range 1 mile. He hasn't seen us yet, Harris murmured. Then let's keep it that way. The Beaufighter banked the engines roaring as Armitage pushed the throttle to the stops. Through the cockpit glass, the faint outline of the German plane appeared against the stars, a shadow on a darker sky. Visual Armitage hissed. Guns stand by. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 4 Hispano cannons roared to life. Tracers streaked forward. The Ju-88 erupted into a ball of flame, vanishing into the abyss below. "Splash 1, Harris said quietly. Armitage exhaled. They'll never know what hit them. He glanced at the glowing radar scope, its sweep line turning lazily across the screen. You ever think about how that little box sees through everything? Harris nodded. Sometimes I think it's looking back. On the ground below, German radar stations along the Kammhuber line scrambled to respond. Operators in freezing bunkers tried to track the battle through flickering scopes, but the sky was filled with phantom echoes. One technician shouted, "Multiple contacts, but they're everywhere," his superior snapped. "That's interference, the British are jamming us again." But it wasn't jamming. It was radar so precise that every Allied plane could weave through their detection grid unseen. Inside the command bunker, Colonel Heinrich Kammhuber, once proud architect of Germany's night defense, stood rigid before his staff. "Gentlemen," he said coldly, "we are blind." In Berlin, Dr. Hans Meyer's latest report landed on Albert Speer's desk. The cover sheet bore a single sentence in Meyer's handwriting. "Our enemy fights with mathematics, not miracles." Speer read it twice before handing it to his aide. "He's right," he said. "They've turned physics into strategy." His aide frowned. "Shall we order more funding for radar research?" Speer shook his head. "No. Funding won't buy time, and time is what we no longer have." He rose, pacing to the window. Below, Berlin still glittered under blacked-out lights, the hum of generators filling the night. "What use are rockets," Speer murmured, "if you can't see where they'll land?" Back in England, the magnetron's reach had extended beyond the sky. In a massive hangar at Portsmouth Navy, technicians installed new radar sets aboard HMS Duke of York and HMS Belfast. The smell of diesel and salt mixed with the ozone of soldering irons. Commander Chet Bragg, now assigned to the Royal Navy Exchange, inspected the finished equipment. "So this box," he said, tapping the metal casing of a Type 273 radar, "can track a submarine periscope at 10 miles. The technician nodded. "And a torpedo wake at 5. The sea's not safe for them anymore, sir." Bragg grinned. "Good. Let the bastards know Poseidon works for us now." He turned to a young sailor who watched the radar sweep in awe. "You see that, lad? That's not a screen, that's a crystal ball." Across the Atlantic, the MIT Radiation Lab prepared another shipment, thousands of magnetrons bound for factories across the U.S. Each one was small enough to fit in a man's hand, yet powerful enough to turn darkness into data. A visiting British officer, Sir Henry Tizard, addressed the engineers. "When we shared the magnetron in 1940, he said we called it our last secret. But what you've done with it, this marriage of science and production, that is America's gift to history. You've built not just a weapon, but a world that sees itself clearly." Applause rippled through the hall, but behind the pride lay exhaustion. The men knew that for every radar-guided bomber that found its target, another crew somewhere would not return. The magnetron had given them vision, not safety. In Peenemünde, Dr. Meyer stood over a German prototype radar dish, frost collecting on its edges. He held a report from the Luftwaffe testing division. "Our centimetric radar failed to detect Allied aircraft. Signal unstable. Range ineffective." Stepp approached, rubbing his hands for warmth. "We've reached our limits, Hans. Even the copper we're using deforms under the frequency." Meyer stared at the dish. "The Americans use mass-purified copper and high-vacuum seals. We can't even build their factory tools, let alone their instruments." Stepp exhaled. Then what do we tell Berlin? Mayer's expression hardened. Tell them what they want to hear. Then pray for a miracle. That night, Mayer sat alone in the lab, the magnetron still resting beneath its glass dome. He ran a finger along the rim, the metal cool and flawless. Outside, the Baltic wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a V-2 rocket streaked upward, vanishing into the clouds. He whispered to the machine, "You won the war, didn't you? Not them, you." The magnetron, silent and unfeeling, reflected his tired face, the ghost of a man chasing the shadow of an idea already gone. In the skies above Europe, Allied radar pulses continued their silent rhythm, invisible music that shaped every decision, every sortie, every victory. The war had entered a new age, one where power no longer came from how far a shell could fly, but from how far a signal could see. July 1943. The North Atlantic and Peenemünde. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of gray waves and broken steel. Convoys moved through the fog like floating cities, silent, slow, and fragile. For years, German U-boats had hunted them here, wolves beneath the water, guided only by periscope and instinct. But now something unseen hunted them. Aboard the destroyer USS Bory, Ensign Calvin Reed hunched over a glowing radar scope in the Combat Information Center. The ship rolled violently, water hammering against the hull. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and coffee gone cold. "Contact bearing 275 degrees, Reed shouted. "Range 3, 800 yards submerged." The captain commander, Chet Bragg, now reassigned from Naval Command to Atlantic escort duty, leaned over his shoulder. "You sure it's not sea clutter?" Reed shook his head. "No, sir. Pattern solid. Slow-moving echo-consistent track." Bragg grinned grimly. "Then let's wake him up." The destroyer heaved as depth charges tumbled into the sea. Seconds later, the ocean erupted in plumes of white spray. Through the static-filled headset, Reed heard it, a short, fading blip, then silence. "Contact lost," he said. Bragg nodded. "He's not lost, son. He's dead." They stood together, watching the gray horizon. "Amazing thing, radar," Bragg muttered. "Used to be you looked for periscopes. Now we listen to ghosts." Reed turned back to the scope, the green light reflecting in his tired eyes. "Feels like the ocean's talking back." 300 miles away, in a U-boat off the coast of Ireland, Kapitän Leutnant Otto Drexler sat in his dim command room, drenched in sweat. His crew whispered nervously, the red emergency lights flickering. "The destroyers. They found us in total fog," whispered the first officer. How Drexler clenched his jaw. "They have some new trick, some cursed American invention." From the corner, the chief engineer muttered, "It's not sonar. We heard nothing." "They saw us, sir. Through the mist. Through the sea." Drexler stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of his dying batteries. "If they can see through water," he said quietly, "then the ocean no longer belongs to us." He looked around the cramped steel coffin of his U-boat and added, "Tell Berlin the Atlantic is lost." In Peenemünde, Dr. Hans Meyer received a transcript of Drexler's report via military courier. The message was underlined twice in red pencil by an intelligence officer, "Enemy detection, likely microwave-based." Meyer leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him. "Microwave," he said aloud, almost laughing. "Of course." Stepp frowned. "You think they've fitted ships with magnetrons?" Meyer nodded. "They've gone beyond airborne radar. Naval ground, maybe even proximity fuses. Every dimension, air, sea, land, is illuminated." Stepp sighed. "We can't even mass-produce our centimetric valves." Meyer opened his notebook and began to write, his pen scratching across the page. "If they can see through darkness and through the sea, the next step will be to see through silence. to see through time itself. He stared at the words and muttered, "And we are still blind." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., inside the polished corridors of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, Vannevar Bush read the decrypted German intelligence report captured by Allied codebreakers. He smiled faintly. "They know we have radar," he said to James Conant, head of the National Defense Research Committee, "but they don't know what it means." Conant adjusted his glasses. "They'll assume it's a weapon." Bush shook his head. "No. It's worse than that. It's knowledge. Knowledge doesn't explode. It spreads." He looked at the magnetron schematic on his desk, dozens of copper cavities drawn with mathematical precision. "The irony," he said softly, "is that we've already moved past this design. They're chasing a ghost while we're building the next generation." Conant smiled. "Then let them chase." Back in England, a bomber crew prepared for another night raid. Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg. Their H-2S radar hummed beneath the floor, powered by the same technology Peenemünde had declared impossible. Flight Lieutenant Arthur McLeod's replacement, Lieutenant Ralph Norris, adjusted the dials. The coastline appeared as a glowing arc on the radar scope. "Target acquired," he said into the intercom. The pilot's voice came back calm and cold. "Copy that. Opening bomb bay." From 18,000 feet, the city below looked peaceful, a mosaic of lights beneath the cloud. Then, as the first flares fell, radar-guided bombers turned that light into fire. In Peenemünde, radar operators monitoring the attack watched in confusion as ghost signals filled their screens. "Sir, we can't get range. The echoes multiply." Meyer listened from a distance, eyes hollow. "You're not seeing them," he said quietly. "You're seeing the future. And it's burning." The following week, Albert Speer visited Peenemünde in person. His black staff car arrived under heavy guard. He walked through the lab eyes, scanning the charts, the prototypes, the exhausted faces. "So this is the place," he said. "The one that tells me why our cities burn." Mayer stood to attention. "Yes, Minister. The Allies have harnessed microwave radar for navigation and bombing. Their precision is beyond anything we can counter." Speer studied the captured magnetron through the glass. "A piece of copper and mathematics," he said softly. "That's all. And it changes everything." He turned to Mayer. "Can you build one?" Mayer shook his head. "Not without the tools to build the tools to build it." Speer's face hardened. "Then build those." Mayer met his gaze. "By the time we do, Minister, the war will already be decided by those who can see." That night, Speer wrote in his private diary, "We are losing not to soldiers but to thinkers. The Allies fight with laboratories as we fight with divisions. The more I see of radar, the more I understand this war is not of steel but of frequency." He closed the notebook and stared out the car window as the darkness swallowed the road ahead. In the distance, Peenemunde's test range glowed briefly, another V-2 rocket, arcing toward the stratosphere, vanishing into nothing. The Germans were still reaching for the heavens. The Allies were already seeing through them. September 1943, over the Bay of Biscay. The low hum of engines rolled through the gray dawn. At 5,000 feet, a coastal command Liberator skimmed the waves, her belly heavy with depth charges. The sea was calm, but her crew were not. Every man had lost friends to the invisible predators of the Atlantic. At the navigator's table, Sergeant Jack Collins tapped his pencil against a green radar screen. A single blip pulsed faintly. "Contact bearing 040, moving slow." The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Dennis Wright, adjusted his course. Could be a fishing trawler. Collins shook his head. Too steady, too deep. It's a U-boat. He reached for the intercom. Captain radar contact confirmed 5 miles and closing, Roger, that Wright replied. Let's go fishing. The Liberator banked hard, the sea rushing up beneath it. The bomb bay doors opened, and the cold Atlantic wind screamed into the cabin. Below the outline of a U-boat surfaced her periscope, retracting too late. Mark IV depth charges dropped, tumbling into the gray. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The explosion ripped the ocean apart. A tower of water shot skyward, followed by black smoke. Direct hit, Collins said, voice trembling. Radar guided us right to her. Wright didn't respond. He just stared ahead, knowing that somewhere in that column of smoke, 80 men had disappeared in silence. He whispered, war's colder when you fight with ghosts. The success of radar in the Atlantic was absolute. What began as Britain's desperate attempt to defend her skies had now extended beneath the waves. Every convoy now sailed with eyes invisible, precise, relentless. The German U-boat fleet, once the pride of Admiral Karl Dönitz, was now dying faster than it could be rebuilt. By the end of 1943, over 40% of all U-boats commissioned that year had been destroyed before completing their first patrol. Inside the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote BDU headquarters in Paris, Dönitz slammed his fist onto the operations table. You tell me, how can they find us before we even attack? A communications officer hesitated. They see us through clouds, Admiral. Through fog. Through night. Dönitz turned to his intelligence chief. Is it radio location? The officer shook his head. No, sir. Something higher, some frequency we don't understand. Dönitz stared down at the Atlantic charts. Red ink marked every lost submarine. Then we are fighting an enemy who sees where we are blind. And blindness at sea, he said quietly, is death. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, radar operators at MIT's RAD lab were already designing systems to track surface vessels at over 30 miles. The new S-band magnetrons worked flawlessly in wet conditions. In one corner of the lab, Dr. Luis Alvarez, one of the most brilliant experimental physicists of his time, demonstrated a new radar display to a visiting Navy officer. He placed a steel model of a destroyer on a water tank. The radar dish emitted a low hum, sweeping in slow arcs. Notice the reflection, Commander Alvarez said. Even at minimal gain, we can track small periscopes or wakes. The magnetron's wavelength cuts through surface clutter. The officer stared at the glowing screen. So the ocean itself can't hide them anymore. Alvarez smiled slightly. Not from us. Meanwhile, deep within the Reich, Dr. Hans Meyer and his assistant Stepp worked in near isolation. Their lab was now starved of copper vacuum tubes and hope. A lone magnetron prototype sat in a vacuum chamber, its power output a fraction of Allied designs. Stepp leaned against the bench, voice flat. You realize, Hans, even if we build one, we have no way to mass produce it. The Allies have factories. We have labs. Meyer exhaled slowly. And that's why we've already lost. Not on the battlefield, but here. He tapped his temple. We lost in the mind. That same month, a Royal Air Force intelligence officer delivered a briefing at Bentley Priory, north of London. Gentlemen, he said, pointing to an intercepted German report. They've found one of our magnetrons, but according to our sources, they can't replicate it. Their physicists estimate they're 10 years behind. A murmur spread through the room. The officer continued. That's 10 years in technology, which in this war might as well be a century. He flipped to the next slide, radar-guided bombing results from Hamburg. The images were brutal, entire industrial districts leveled precise beyond belief. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "the magnetron is not a weapon, it's a compass to the future." That night, far from the laboratories and war rooms, Flight Lieutenant Norris flew another mission over Germany. The bomber shuddered under flak. The crew shouted over the roar of engines. And yet beneath the chaos, the radar operator's calm voice echoed through the intercom. "On course. Target locked. Adjust heading 5 degrees starboard." Through the black clouds, they dropped their payload, guided not by the stars, but by waves of invisible light born from the hands of scientists who had never fired a gun. At Peenemünde, Meyer received one final note from Berlin Suspend Radar Research. "Focus all efforts on rocketry." He stared at the telegram in silence. Stepp asked, "What will you do now?" Meyer folded the message and placed it beside the inert magnetron. "I'll keep working," he said quietly, "because someday when the shooting stops, the world will want to see again." As the winter of 1943 closed in, the world's first electronic battlefield was already complete. The Allies no longer fought in darkness. Every movement, every convoy, every bombing run was now guided by the heartbeat of the magnetron, pulsing invisibly across the globe. To the men who built it, it was just a machine. To history, it was the sound of inevitability. February 1944. Rotterdam, the Netherlands. The night was cold and brittle, the kind of cold that made every metal surface sing. Over the Dutch coast, a lone Royal Air Force Mosquito limped home, one engine trailing smoke, the other coughing under stress. Inside, Pilot Officer Andrew McIntyre fought the controls, while his navigator, Sergeant Lionel Briggs, yelled over the roar. "We're losing pressure, bail out!" "Andy, not yet," McIntyre shouted. "We're still over enemy lines." Flak burst outside, brilliant orange and far too close. The Mosquito's right wing tore open, flames licking across the fuselage. "Now, Lionel, go." The two men leapt into the frozen void. Their parachutes opened against the black sky. Seconds later, their aircraft and its precious cargo plummeted into a field near Rotterdam. When the wreckage cooled, a German recovery team arrived. They carried rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, expecting to find little more than twisted debris. But as the engineers combed through the wreckage, one of them, Lieutenant Franz Dietrich, a Luftwaffe signals officer, knelt beside a metal box half buried in mud. "Sir," he called, "you'd better see this." Inside the shattered casing was a small copper assembly, intricate, symmetrical, and unmistakably alien to their eyes. Dietrich brushed the dirt away. "This isn't a radio. It's something else." He stared at it, and in that moment, without yet understanding, he held the future of radar in his hands. Within hours, the device was on a train bound for Berlin, escorted under armed guard. The accompanying report read, "Recovered from crashed RAF Mosquito. Appears to be a high-frequency oscillator. Function unknown." By the next day, it sat on the desk of Dr. Hans Meyer in Peenemünde. When he opened the crate, he froze. The magnetron gleamed faintly in the fluorescent light, its copper cavities untouched, its design impossibly refined. Stepp looked over his shoulder. "What is it?" Meyer didn't answer. He just whispered, "It's what I thought it would look like." He turned it over carefully, studying the precision of the machining, the impossibly smooth vacuum seals, the compact elegance of the engineering. "This is no crude transmitter," Meyer said. "This is the heart of their radar." For the next 48 hours, Meyer and his team worked without rest. They measured wavelengths, tested frequencies, and nearly destroyed their instruments in the process. When they finally stabilized the readings, the results were staggering. 3-centimeter wavelength, Meyer muttered. "Do you understand what this means?" Stepp nodded slowly. "They can track a submarine periscope from the air. Detect a bomber through cloud. Mayer sat back, exhausted. They can see everything. He wrote the final line of his report in neat, unflinching script. We estimate our current microwave capability is approximately 8 to 10 years behind Allied technology. He placed the report in an envelope marked Top Secret and handed it to a courier. When the door closed, he slumped into his chair, eyes fixed on the magnetron. 10 years, he whispered, in a war measured in months. In Berlin, the report landed on Albert Speer's desk once again. He read it in silence. When he finally looked up, his aide asked, "Shall I brief the Führer?" Speer shook his head. No, he wouldn't understand. The aide frowned. Then what should we do? Speer turned toward the window where anti-aircraft searchlights traced futile lines across the night sky. What can we do, he said softly, against an enemy that fights with light? Back in Peenemünde, Meyer continued studying the device in secret. The war around him was unraveling fuel shortages, Allied bombing raids, soldiers starving on the Eastern Front. But here, in the silence of his lab, he touched perfection, something so advanced, it seemed to mock the chaos outside. Stepp entered quietly, holding a cup of cold coffee. They're evacuating the research teams to the Harz Mountains. Mayer didn't look up. Let them evacuate. I'm staying. Stepp hesitated. Why? It's hopeless. Mayer turned the magnetron over in his hands, the copper surface gleaming like fire in the lamplight. Because someday, someone will ask how we lost. And I'll tell them we didn't lose to armies. We lost to a frequency. That night, in the dim light of the laboratory, he set the magnetron on the table and switched off the lamp. The small copper device reflected the faint light from the window, a dying world staring into the eyes of its conqueror. Outside, the distant rumble of Allied bombers rolled across the Baltic. Inside, Mayer whispered to the darkness, "You won the war before we even knew it started." While German physicists dissected the magnetron, the Allies were already deploying radar-guided proximity fuses in anti-aircraft shells and airborne mapping radar in B-17 and B-24 bombers. The battle had moved beyond sight, beyond sound, into the invisible spectrum, and Germany would never catch up. In early 1944, the magnetron was quietly transferred from Peenemünde to a secure bunker near Berlin. It never returned to use. By then, its secret had already circled the globe, carried by the very waves it created. March, June, 1944. England and Germany. London hummed like a generator. Factories worked 24 hours a day, pouring copper, steel, and sweat into machines that pulsed with invisible energy. Every RAF bomber, every destroyer, every coastal outpost now thrummed with radar, an orchestra of electromagnetic sight. Inside the telecommunications research establishment TRE in Malvern, technicians huddled over radar consoles, the glow of their cathode ray tubes painting ghostly green halos on their faces. Test transmission to H2X prototype mark frequency. A burst of static hissed through the room. Then a sharp rhythmic pulse appeared on the screen. "Signal clean," said Dr. Joan Curran, adjusting her headset. "Resolution perfect. We can distinguish a building from a tree at 10 miles. Her colleague, Sir Robert Watson-Watt, smiled faintly. 10 miles, he said. Then Berlin has nowhere left to hide. Meanwhile, across the channel, the German war machine began to choke on its own complexity. Every Allied radar upgrade was matched by another German attempt at jamming deception or detection, and everyone failed. At Peenemünde, the magnetron sat under lock and key, a relic of a war already lost in the laboratory. Dr. Hans Meyer and his assistant Stepp were now ordered to divert their expertise toward anti-radar countermeasures, primitive noise transmitters that jammed Allied sets by flooding the airwaves with chaos. Like throwing sand into the wind, Stepp muttered as they adjusted dials. Mayer nodded, and hoping it blinds the sun. By April 1944, the Allies' radar advantage had evolved beyond surveillance. They were now using it to command the battlefield itself. In the English countryside near Portsmouth, radar stations coordinated the flow of aircraft in preparation for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. On massive plotting tables, hundreds of small wooden markers moved under the hands of officers as radio reports came in. Convoy Baker forming at Solent, said one operator. LSTs aligning course 080. The senior controller nodded. Radar confirms formation integrity. Maintain blackout. Keep transmissions tight. Outside under a full moon, the sea glimmered with the silhouettes of ships, thousands of them, preparing to cross the channel. Unseen by any German eye, their movements were tracked and protected by radar waves bouncing invisibly across the sea. It was the quiet before the loudest dawn in human history. In Berlin, news of strange Allied activity reached Albert Speer's intelligence desk. He called Mayer to report. Our coastal stations detect enormous electromagnetic interference, Speer said. Could this be radar? Mayer nodded. Yes. They're guiding an invasion. Speer frowned. Then why can't our radars detect their ships? Mayer sighed. Because our sets use metric wavelengths. Their magnetrons work in centimeters. We're deaf to them. He paused, then added, We should pray it's not too late. June 5, 1944. The eve of D-Day. At RAF Southwick House, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over a table crowded with maps and signal reports. Beside him, Group Captain James Stagg read the latest weather radar updates. Storm fronts clearing in 12 hours, Stagg said. Windows tight, but possible. Eisenhower nodded slowly. Then we go. In a corner of the room, a radar operator called out from his console. German coastal stations are quiet. They have no red on our convoys. Eisenhower looked up. No radar, no interception, he said quietly. God bless the magnetron. At 2200 hours, Allied ships advanced across the English Channel. The sea glowed faintly under cloud-filtered moonlight, but radar scopes painted the scene in perfect clarity. On board the USS Ancon, a radar officer shouted over the wind, echoes, clean, LST formations aligned. Paratrooper drops, tracking correctly. Keep the channels open, his commander replied. If the Germans can't see us, then tonight we're invisible. And they were. The storm, the jamming, the radar invisibility, everything conspired to blind the German coastal batteries until it was too late. At Peenemünde, Mayer listened to fragmented radio reports. Landings. Normandy. Thousands of ships. Stepp turned from the receiver, pale. Hans, they did it. They crossed. Mayer nodded slowly, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Of course they did. They could see the shore before they reached it. He looked out the window toward the dark Baltic sky. The war's outcome was written the moment they built this, he said, tapping the magnetron. And we've been reading the last chapter ever since. By dawn, the Allies had established beachheads across Normandy. German counterattacks failed one after another, not because of poor tactics, but because every German movement was tracked in real time by airborne radar ships' guns, guided by centimetric precision. Radar had become not just an eye, but a mind, one that could predict, anticipate, and strike. Mayer's final note that morning was brief. Their eyes do not sleep. The war in Europe would grind on for another 11 months, but the magnetron had already decided its fate. The Germans could no longer hide their submarines, their night fighters, or even their own deception. Every secret frequency, every coded transmission, every cloud they thought would protect them all betrayed them through the air. It wasn't magic. It was physics, cold, relentless, and exact. And in war, that was the truest kind of power. Autumn 1944. Peenemünde and Allied command centers. The Baltic wind cut through the cracked windows of Peenemunde's laboratory. Most of the compound lay in ruins. The Allies had bombed it 3 times that summer, turning the once proud cradle of German research into a graveyard of glass and twisted steel. Inside, Dr. Hans Meyer sat at his workbench surrounded by the remains of his instruments. The captured Allied magnetron still sat in its case untouched, but unforgotten, the silent proof of how far behind they had fallen. His assistant, Ernst Stepp, entered quietly, his boots crunching on broken glass. "They're evacuating the last of the staff, Hans. The army wants us in Bavaria." Meyer didn't look up. "To build what a miracle, they say they still need scientists." "Not thinkers," Meyer replied bitterly. "Just hands. To assemble toys while the world burns." He finally looked up from the copper device on his table. "This little machine," he said softly, "ended our empire. Not a bomb, not a tank, this." At that same moment, across the channel in southern England, another kind of empire was in motion. Inside RAF Bentley Priory, a young radar operator named Sergeant Margaret Ellison monitored a display tracking the skies over France. A single sweep of green light illuminated hundreds of dots, Allied aircraft, bombers, transports, fighters, all moving like a single living organism. Her supervisor leaned over her shoulder. "You ever think about what that screen really is, Maggie?" She smiled faintly. "A map," he shook his head. "It's a heartbeat." He tapped the screen. "Every blip is a pulse. Every sweep, another second of life for the boys flying out there. They live because we see." Ellison nodded quietly. "And the Germans?" He exhaled. "They're still blind." In Peenemünde, Meyer drafted one final report before burning his research notes. The paper smelled faintly of ozone and smoke. He wrote, "Our analysis of the Allied magnetron confirms an industrial precision and vacuum quality beyond current Reich capacity. Even if replicated, its supporting infrastructure, mass cathode production, advanced metallurgy, miniaturization, remains years beyond our reach." He paused before adding, almost as a confession, "It is not that we could not imagine it. It is that we could not afford to believe it existed." He signed his name and sealed the envelope. Then, for the first time in 3 years, he turned off the lights in his lab. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Vannevar Bush presented a report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Behind him stood a large chalkboard covered in wave diagrams and radar schematics. He spoke with calm precision. "Gentlemen, radar specifically, the magnetron has done more to shape the outcome of this war than any single weapon. It has guided bombers, saved convoys, and blinded the enemy. And when we deploy its principles to navigation, communication, and meteorology, it will reshape peace as surely as it has reshaped war." One admiral leaned forward. "And the Germans, how close were they?" Bush smiled faintly. "A decade, maybe more. Their scientists knew the theory, but not the manufacturing art. They lacked the discipline of industry and the chaos of freedom." He paused, letting that line settle. "They built rockets to touch the stars. We built radar to see them." In late 1944, the tide of war had turned completely. From Normandy to the Ardennes, Allied forces advanced under an umbrella of radar coverage. Mobile radar units guided artillery fire, tracked enemy armor movements, and directed fighter sweeps in real time. Even the weather was now a weapons storm tracking radar, allowed commanders to plan operations with precision unimaginable just 2 years earlier. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF in Paris, a signal officer pointed at a moving radar plot on the wall. "That's the last of the Luftwaffe's night bombers," he said. "They won't make it home." The commander nodded. The day they lost radar, they lost the sky. In the ruins of Peenemünde, Meyer watched from a distance as Allied bombers crossed overhead the same machines his work had once tried to stop. He turned to Stepp. "You hear that?" Stepp nodded. "Engines." Meyer shook his head. "No. That's the sound of frequency." He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "We taught ourselves how to fly. They taught themselves how to see." The two men stood in silence as another wave of aircraft vanished into the clouds, unseen but unstoppable. A few weeks later, in a bunker outside Berlin, the magnetron was quietly packed into a crate and labeled Untersuchung abgeschlossen, investigation complete. It was never studied again. When the Allies reached the city in May 1945, they found the crate intact, still sealed. Inside lay the same small copper heart that had changed the course of the war, silent, untouched, eternal. And far away in a laboratory at MIT, engineers built a new generation of radar, using refined magnetrons, smaller, stronger, and more precise. The war had proven that the most powerful weapon on Earth wasn't explosive. It was knowledge organized into frequency. Radar had not just seen through clouds and darkness. It had seen through arrogance, secrecy, and disbelief. May 1945 to 1946, Berlin, London, and Boston. Berlin was silent now. The city that once roared with parades and engines had collapsed into ash and echo. Between the skeletons of buildings, Allied soldiers picked their way through rubble smoke rising like ghosts from the earth. Among the search teams that entered the German Reich Ministry of Armaments, one officer found a small crate buried beneath fallen masonry. The label read, Untersuchung abgeschlossen, Untersuchung Peenemünde 1944. He pried it open. Inside lay the magnetron, still intact, still humming with history. He held it up to the light, its copper chambers gleaming faintly under the gray Berlin sky. "Whatever this is," he muttered, "it looks like the future." In London, news of the discovery reached the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Sir Robert Watson Watt stood over the report, hands clasped behind his back. "So," he said, "they finally found it." His assistant smiled. "In perfect condition. Peenemünde never figured it out." Watson Watt nodded slowly. "They understood the math, but not the humanity. We built this to save lives. They built their science to worship power." He turned toward the window where the morning sun broke through the clouds. "That's why they lost. Not because they were blind, but because they refused to see." Across the Atlantic, at MIT's radiation laboratory, the magnetron's descendants were already being reborn, smaller, faster, and ready for peace. Dr. Luis Alvarez stood before a group of young engineers pointing to a radar image projected on the wall. "This," he said, "was once used to find U-boats. Now we'll use it to find storms." The audience laughed softly, but Alvarez's expression was serious. "Every war leaves behind a machine that outlives it. The magnetron is ours. It will shape everything that follows: aviation, weather, communication, even the stars." He paused, then added, "It's not a weapon anymore. It's an eye." Meanwhile, in the American zone of occupied Germany, Dr. Hans Meyer and Ernst Stepp were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. The two men sat under bare light bulbs, faces gaunt but composed. "You worked at Peenemünde?" the officer asked. Meyer nodded. "Until the end." "Did you ever complete your radar research?" Meyer hesitated. "Then, no. We were always looking backward." He nodded toward the Allied insignia on the officer's sleeve. "We're looking forward." The officer leaned forward. "You realize that small copper thing in your lab changed everything?" Mayer's lips curved faintly. "Yes, I know. I saw the future once. It was smaller than a coffee cup." When the interview ended, Mayer stepped outside. The spring air smelled faintly of rain and ash. Above him, Allied planes droned through the clouds, radar-equipped, their flight paths perfect. Stepp joined him on the steps. "They're rebuilding," he said. Mayer nodded. "Yes, with light." He looked out toward the horizon. "We tried to control the world. They learned to see it." That summer, in a small lab in Boston, engineers conducted an experiment that marked the true beginning of the post-war world. They placed a magnetron inside a microwave enclosure and powered it for testing. Nearby, a chocolate bar in a technician's pocket melted. He blinked in surprise. "Well, that's odd." The technician's name was Percy Spencer, and by year's end, his discovery would evolve into a new invention, the microwave oven. A weapon of war had become a tool of life. Back in Europe, a British historian compiling the official war record of the Scientific Intelligence Division wrote one quiet paragraph. When the Germans examined the Allied magnetron, they realized their technology was 10 years behind. It was not merely a gap in machinery, but a gap in imagination. The war was lost, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory, to an idea so small it fit in the palm of a man's hand. He paused before adding one last sentence. The magnetron did not destroy cities. It revealed them. In the years that followed, radar spread everywhere to airports, weather stations, ships, and civilian aircraft. The invisible waves that had once hunted submarines now guided passenger planes through storms. The magnetron's heartbeat still pulsed through the atmosphere, unseen but everywhere. And those who had built it, from the soot-covered engineers in Birmingham to the sleepless physicists in Boston, had changed the world, not with fire, but with vision. In the end, when people spoke of the machines that decided the Second World War, they mentioned tanks, bombers, and rockets. But those who truly understood whispered another name. A name not shouted in victory, nor carved in stone, but etched quietly into every radar scope, every microwave tower, every aircraft navigation system that came after. The magnetron. The machine that saw everything. The invention that turned light itself into a weapon and then into peace.